My husband David will tell you that I have one of the most unique methods for organization probably that you've ever seen. And that is that I have no problem making a bigger mess in order to make a smaller one more organized. Let me explain. So let's say for a minute that Lola's toys need reorganizing. I am one of those people who will dump every toy she has into the middle of the room so that I can have those nice, clean, ready-to-go bins and just stick everything in there. It sounds crazy, I know. It's my method, and it works for me. But the point really of telling you all of this is because what I've learned in life is that sometimes what seems like a chaotic mess is actually just part of a larger process. And so this morning, what I want to invite you to do as we turn to the trial of Jesus as found in Luke 23, I want you to use this as the framework through which we listen to these verses. And so what I want to invite you to do is to turn to Luke 23, 1 through 25. Let me give you the page number here. 859. Oh, you get a good Bible drill. Congratulations. You get lemonade and cookies outside after the service. Everybody else may join you, but it's really for you. Okay. So as you're turning to page 859, I'm going to invite True and Tina and Victor forward. We're going to do something a little bit different this morning. As I read this passage this week, I realized that there are 4 different voices that are kind of speaking to one another. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read Luke 23 this morning, 1 through 25, in what's known as a reader's theater style. So the scripture will be read by all 4 voices. I'll be reading the part of the narrator. Tina will be reading the part of the crowd. True will be reading the part of Pilate. And Victor will be reading the part of Jesus. So I'll put back up that framework for you to listen in. And so now, without further ado, Luke 23, 1 through 25. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying,
"We found this man perverting this nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king."
Then Pilate asked him,
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
Jesus answered,
"You say so."
Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds,
"I find no basis for an accusation against this man."
But they were insistent and said,
"He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place."
When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he'd been wanting to see him for a long time. He had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some signs. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them,
"You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him."
Then they all shouted out together,
"Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us.
This was a man who had been put in prison for insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting,
Crucify him! Crucify him!
A third time, Pilate said to them,
Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him.
But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder. And he handed Jesus over as they wished. Thank you. I don't know if anybody could read that text or see it and not be immediately aware of the amount of injustice and wrong that is in the middle and embedded in that passage. It really is one of those chaotic messes, kind of like that image of all of Lola's toys in the middle of the room. And so this morning we're going to take one by one, piece by piece, and put it back in place and see if we can get a clear picture of what at first glance just seems like a mess. So let's start with the reality of what the crowds were really accusing Jesus of. The crowds are really accusing Jesus of being a false prophet. The problem is they don't have any ability to do anything to Jesus on a grander scale, which is what they're wanting to do. Remember, the chief priests had gotten to the point where they are really wanting to kind of destroy Jesus, and they don't have the ability to do that on their own right. So they are looking to have the Romans get rid of Jesus for them. The problem is a Roman government, a Roman official doesn't really have much interest in little squabbles between people in a religious sect. So it would be like me going to the chief of police and saying, look, here's the deal. Somebody was sitting in Leona's pew. I need you to come in and move them. It was that ridiculous. And they weren't going to get involved. So what the people decided to do was to couch their issue with Jesus in language that would appeal to the Roman government, that would appeal to a Roman official, that would appeal to Pilate. So they couched the language in the language of treason. Now remember a couple weeks ago when we talked about the kingdom and the coin, that saying don't pay taxes to Caesar was an act of treason. So they're accusing Jesus of saying this, knowing that this is an act of treason. But what we learned a few weeks ago is Jesus never said that. So they're lying. And they're saying that he's inciting riots against the people. Really what they're doing is they're playing in to Pilate's fear. Now, a Roman official was put over their region really for one purpose, and that was to kind of keep the Roman authority in that place. They were going to collect the taxes for the Roman authority. They were going to make sure that everybody knew who was in charge, and they were going to keep the peace. That was Pilate's job. And Pilate knew that if that job didn't take place, if he didn't do that right, Caesar was going to kick him out of there. And so the people are going in and they are kind of prodding at his insecurity. They're prodding at his fear, and they have picked the perfect person to do this to. Because what we oftentimes don't know in reading this passage is that the reality is Pilate had had several run-ins with the Jewish people. And I'll just say this, it was obvious that he had a distaste for them, because his reactions were over and above the top. This is the perfect recipe for getting rid of Jesus. This is ingenious when it comes down to it. There's lies that play into fear, and it's the perfect person to believe all of it. The situation seems ideal for what they want done, and then Pilate doesn't play his part very well, does he? Pilate kind of kicks Jesus off and says, go to Herod. Now, some scholars think that actually this is Pilate just still trying to rub into the Jewish people who he didn't like and mess with them a bit more. Other people think he really saw that Jesus was innocent. The reality is we don't know. What we do know is he goes to Herod, and for those who are following Jesus around, who are following and trying to determine whether or not their Lord, this person that they have been following, whether the injustice of what's being said is going to be seen, you can see the level of hope go up. As Jesus goes before Herod, and how fast that probably crashed when they saw how Herod treated Jesus. Herod treats Jesus like a court magician, doesn't he? Do a trick for me, Jesus. And then he treats him like a court jester, making fun of him, prodding at him. And so Jesus comes back before Pilate, fully humiliated. And Pilate still doesn't see anything wrong with him. But the people's intensity is growing. And with their intensity, Pilate's anxiety is growing. And so you see him begin to wane on what perhaps was strong morals in the beginning, on what perhaps at the beginning was him saying, I'm not willing to do anything for someone who I know is innocent. We see him beginning to wane when he offers to flog Jesus. You see, flogging was reserved for the guilty. So that means that he is saying with his mouth, Jesus is innocent, but his actions would have said otherwise. But the people intensify even more. They want the full punishment for treason, which was crucifixion. And as they push and push and push, Pilate gives in. He gives in and says yes, agrees to crucify a man who he knows, who he believes is innocent. This is a mess. This is one of those incredible injustices that when put in movie form, if you're like me, you would just be bawling in the theater, screaming at the TV. Don't you understand he's innocent? Don't you understand what's going on? It should raise that kind of emotion in us. And perhaps you felt it this morning as you heard it read again, that crying out of the injustice of what you're seeing. And that's exactly what is intended to do. But if you're like me, perhaps in the middle of that, you noticed something strange. In verse 12, as if Luke for a minute decided to go on a minor tangent, he adds in, oh, and by the way, the two of them became friends. Can you imagine me telling you that story? So there's this incredible injustice. There's this guy, and he's been on this trial, and he's been sentenced to death row. In fact, it's not even just death row. It's like the fast lane to death row. But you know what? Out of the middle of it, the two lawyers became best friends. Can you imagine that even being in the same sentence? This hit me this week as I read this passage over and over again and thought, Luke, I got to be honest with you, I got no idea why you'd throw this in the middle of this passage. And then I stepped back, and I began to think about the big picture, and I began to think about how we've seen God work time and time again. And that the reality is, sometimes God is at work in the midst of chaos. Paul in Romans 6, 3 and 4 looks back on the death and resurrection of Jesus, and he says this: "Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into the death of Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in the newness of life." This incredible injustice is exactly what Jesus had to go through so that death and sin would be defeated. And it is defeated. And so in God's big, huge plan, what we find is what we find in Romans 8, right? Where it says that God works all things together for good for those who love him. That God can work redemption in the midst of chaos, in the midst of our human imperfections. That is an incredible promise that we find. Because the truth is, as human beings, we are in and of ourselves chaotic, imperfect, messed up, messy individuals. And on our own, that's exactly what we would remain. But here we find a promise that even in the midst of the messiness and the chaos, that God either is at work or that God can redeem whatever is going on so that his work can be done. So this morning I want to ask you, invite you to consider, how does this intersect with your life this morning? We've heard of several instances today of injustice and things happening that just don't make sense. And I would remind you that sometimes we rely on where it says, just like we talked about a moment ago, that there are seasons for everything. And at times, the season is for mourning. And at times, the season is to not look and say, oh, God's going to work something good out of this. And we have times in our life when our own anxiety around wanting to make something better makes it so that we can look at someone in the midst of hurt and say, it's okay. It's okay. God's going to work this out for good. Sometimes God working something out for good is letting someone sit in their hurt and being present with them in that. And sometimes the best thing we can do is be present with them in that. Because life is messy and uncomfortable. Perhaps this morning it meets up where you are and you are able to look at your life and say, I'm going to be really honest with you. I am messy and chaotic. I hurt people. I say things the wrong way. I sin every day. And I have a hard time imagining that God can be at work in the middle of that. And yet the promise here is that even in our imperfections, God can use even those imperfections to bring us closer to him. So where are you today? What is the truth embedded in this that you need to hear today? And will you rely on that place? And know that either the Lord mourns with you, or hear the words of grace, you are forgiven. Repent, turn, and believe and move forward. May we be a people who embrace this promise and live in a way that reveals that.